Coming up.
The evacuation itself?
The evacuation, during the evacuation.
The overall evacuation.
Yeah,
right?
and specifically in those final hours when things were going sideways.
Would you consider the evacuation to be a success despite leaving 1,300 Canadians and interpreters that are forced to fend for themselves against the Taliban?
Minister, did Canadian Armed Forces at all at any point in time express any concern about the change in direction after August 13th?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Minister, what date exactly did the Canadian Armed Forces operation take place to escort Afghans to the airport in Kabul?
So
The specific dates
of
the operation. When everything was all falling apart.
So the actual evacuation, when the Canadian Armed Forces, we had a request for assistance from Global Affairs on July 27th, and on the July 30th, the CAF, we had approval to deploy to Afghanistan.
Okay, and so when was the last day of operations in Afghanistan?
The last days of operation for the evacuation you're asking about, or last days of
the evacuation?
The 27th of August.
Which one?
27th of August.
Okay. Now you...
I would say the last Canadian Armed Forces left at that time. I don't remember the exact date when the actual flight of the last people left, but the official date was 27th.
Okay. Now you're quoted in that Globe story that you're talking about that you provided direction to the Canadian Armed Forces through the appropriate chain of command, and you've said that again in your testimony today. So who at the Canadian Armed Forces did you gave direction to?
So are you talking about the Globe article or my statement?
Your statement. Who did you?
My current statement.
Yeah.
Yes, to the chain of command, to the Chief of Defence Staff.
And only to the Chief of Defence Staff, or you talk to others as well?
No, when it comes to, as you know, when it's Chief of Defence Staff is the person that as you know, as the Minister of Defence works through, but there's always the staff that's always there.
Okay, so he was the very first person in the Canadian Armed Forces that you talked to?
To be honest, there's people in the room, and when it comes to the information, it's within a large group. As you know, you as Parliamentary Secretary, you know the number of people that are there.
Did you inform the Prime Minister's office before you gave this direction to the Canadian Armed Forces?
No, I was working directly and with the evacuation.
Okay, and do you see that there is any difference between giving a ministerial direction versus giving a command?
What are you referring to here?
No, did you see this as, or do you think the Canadian Armed Forces interpreted that you said this is what's going to happen and that was more of a command? Or was it just you saying, no, I think we should do this?
So first,
in your conversations with the chain of command.
Let's talk about what in particular are you talking about here? When it comes to direction and command of what?
Command of the evacuation of Canadians and the priority and Afghans and other minority groups within Afghanistan.
Oh, the overall evacuation? Yeah. Yes, that was the direction that was given.
Okay, and that would have been interpreted as a command from the Minister of National Defence.
Of the direction, and is obviously given the authority for the Canadian Armed Forces to work. Yes.
Okay, and did your former Chief of Staff George Young participate in these meetings and also help in making sure that directive was carried out?
I had a staff, yes, the chief of staff, and my staff is always there to work.
And
yes.
George Young would have been your Chief of Staff at that time?
Yes, he was.
And then you're aware that today the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration actually issued a letter to the Minister of Immigration and Citizenship asking them to further investigate the role that Mr. Young played in the fraudulent use of documents and templates from Global Affairs Canada in the evacuation of Kabul?
Well, first of all, I just heard that report came out. I haven't read it, but I'm here to answer questions regarding the motion that all of you approved here.
So what exact date then was your Chief of Defence Staff, which was General Eyre at the time, was the acting Chief of Defence Staff? Was he made aware of this decision, the exact firm date?
Which decision are you talking about?
The decision
actual
to move
order
ahead
to start
with
the evacuation
of Kabul and
so as I stated here, we had authority. We had received a request for assistance on July 27th, and July 30th was the direction and authority given for CAF to deploy to Afghanistan to support.
And that's when that direction was given as to the priority list of who were taking out Canadians and other Afghans.
The authority to support the evacuation mission.
Okay, and when was CANSOF, Special Operation Forces, were they in that room on that very day, or did that when you gave that direction?
Well, Mr. Bazan, as you know how that works, having you worked at in defense, it's not that the CANSOF is actually there. You work through the Chief of Defense Staff and the chain of command.
So did you have a personal conversation at all with the commanders at CANSOF at that time?
I did not have a direct conversation with the commander of CANSOF, no.
At any time between the time the order came down, July 30th, until August 27th?
No, I did not speak to the commander of CANSOF, no.
Okay. Can you give us the exact specifics, or do you have a copy? Was there a written directive, or was it just a verbal directive that you gave?
No, once we received the request for assistance, you provide, I don't have the exact letter of the direction of authority that I gave to the Canadian Armed Forces at that time.
Okay, so do you know then at what point in time that Special Operation Forces and JTF-2 were given the command that they were to leave the Kabul airport and go outside the wire and take on that extra risk?
Well, again, what are you referring to? The evacuation itself?
The evacuation, during the evacuation.
The overall evacuation.
Yeah, and specifically in those final hours when things were going sideways and there was people, we know that there was Canadians and Afghan interpreters and others that were trying to get through the wire to get into the airport and were being denied, and Special Operation Forces and JTF-2 had to leave the airport. Are you aware?
Had to leave the airport. Well, I think it's important for you to clarify.
Well, to the rendezvous point, right?
Because I think you're making trying to say something without specifics here. If you can ask me very directly what you're saying, then I can answer the question more clearly here. Because when you talk about a rendezvous point, it seems to me that you're referring to the Globe article here.
Well, somebody else is going to have to ask that question because Mr. Bazan is out of time. Madame Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here with us today to answer some questions. You spoke about a letter that had been signed by several members of different parties. And so just to clarify, this was a letter from a parliamentary friendship group, or was it just a letter from MPs?
This was actually a letter that we got a copy here from members of Parliament from 3 different parties that had signed it, 25 members of Parliament.
And it was asking for the Immigration Department to create a specific pathway program to assist humanitarily Sikhs in Afghanistan as well as other minority communities.
And this letter here particularly, if I could have to read it out, and I can tell you exactly who they were referring to. It was referring to Sikhs and Hindus.
Okay. So thank you very much. And I'm wondering, what the process was at that point. I know that the Government of Canada had other minorities to include in that list. Can you include the full list of minorities that were to be evacuated if accepted by Canada? And once you read that list, if you can tell us what the process was for those people to get out.
Absolutely. First of all, it was the Minister of Immigration who actually announced the program. It was on July 23rd. The Special Immigration Measures Pathway was announced, and that was on July 23rd. And August 13th, it was expanded at that time by the Minister of Immigration to include vulnerable groups such as women leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, persecuted religious minorities, LGBTQI individuals, and family members of previously settled interpreters.
I wanted to know how you received the information as to the location of the 225 Sikh community members. Was it via phone, text message? How did they communicate with you?
You actually called me directly.
During the evacuation, there were many NGOs, as you spoke about, reaching out to the government to protect a lot of those marginalized communities. They spoke about the challenges facing, obviously, feminist activists, 2SL, LGBTQIA plus community members. Sikhs are included in that. Hindus were included in that. Why was it that the NGOs were raising this before the government acted at the time?
I mean, you would have to talk to the Minister of Immigration about that and or Global Affairs. One thing I can tell you, I mean, as a member of Parliament, I had my own advocacy work that was taking place. But one thing I can assure you, once I had the authority, we put every effort possible to evacuate as many people as possible. And I want to say this, safely as well. And that was a very key concern to making sure that we did it in a safe manner. And I wish, we could have got all vulnerable populations out that we needed to get out that was actually on our list. But we can also say that many people who are actually here today, and I and hopefully some of you have met some of those folks and their families who have made it here safely because of those efforts. And again, just want to thank the Canadian Armed Forces for putting themselves in extreme risk for pulling off a very important mission.
Madame Gallant, 5 minutes.
Minister, did you get all the Canadians out of Afghanistan and are they all out? Did you get them all out?
I can't answer that question for you. I've talked to Global Affairs Canada. They hold the information regarding for those.
Would you consider the evacuation to be a success despite leaving 1,300 Canadians and interpreters that are forced to fend for themselves against the Taliban?
And I wish we could have gotten more. However, given the circumstances and the security threats that we were dealing with, I'm extremely proud of what the Canadian Armed Forces pulled off with our closest allies.
Can you give us an exact estimate of how many of those are left behind today?
I can't. Again, we don't track, and I'm not the minister in charge. Global Affairs normally holds that database and that information.
What actions have you undertaken to take responsibility for the 1,300 Canadians and interpreters that you've left stranded back in the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan?
I answered a few of your questions, but what I would say is I thought the questions were regarding the motion at hand regarding the Afghan 6, whether I actually inappropriately used Canadian Armed Forces members to get vulnerable people out. I just want to make it clear so that you fully are aware that those folks were actually part of the government policy and that I was executing government policy at that time.
Yes, and I'm talking about the mission as a whole. Why was it that the Prime Minister called the election on the same day that the Taliban overtook Kabul?
Madame Gallant, we are wandering way far from the motion here, so maybe you should direct that question to Mr. Trudeau.
Okay, so what kit and equipment were provided to the soldiers to undertake the direction provided to the CAF by the minister during Op Aegis?
Sorry, could you repeat?
So,
Operation which one?
What kind of vehicles what were provided for Op Aegis?
The evacuation mission?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, when it comes to the list of the equipment, this is where we don't get into details of that. Once the direction is given, you leave it for the Canadian Armed Forces to decide what is actually necessary. Whatever is needed, they figure that out, and they did. Our job is to make sure that they had the authority for them to do their work.
Okay, so you didn't ensure that the CAF had everything they needed to carry out the mission, to carry out the evacuation of Canadians?
That is the responsibility of the chain of command and the Chief of Defence Staff all the way through. But one thing I can assure you, many times we ask that question, is there anything else that is needed? And I can assure you that we were monitoring things very closely, and the Canadian Armed Force, from what I saw, was moving resources in anticipation, and they did absolutely amazing work in extreme circumstances.
Are you aware of whether or not they had any armored vehicles, any artillery? After all, they had to go and evacuate our Canadian citizens and interpreters.
So the safety part was extremely important. What we, as ministers or secretaries of equivalent, we looked at getting advice from our chiefs of defense staff on could we relaunch the mission after the evacuation. The advice we were given is that yes, we could. In terms of all the resources that were needed, not just from us, but we worked together as allies. I remember my first call was with the UK, and then we both spoke with the Secretary of Defense at that time, decided that we could, and then we had our military folks work collaboratively to put the operation together. But we don't get into the details of what equipment is actually going to be needed. That's for them to decide.
How many of our Canadian forces were injured during the evacuation?
None that I was reported. But again, I just want to make sure that, going back to the motion here, that you fully understand that the Afghan Sikhs and Hindus were part of the government policy, because that's what the motion, what we're here to discuss, though, right?
I believe that we're here to discuss the operation as a whole of
No,
the evacuation.
I've not. Mr. Chair, if you can clarify that.
Correct. We're here to discuss whether the minister at the time, inappropriate, used his authority to give a preference to a particular group. And that's what we're here for. So you have about 30 seconds left.
Okay, so what specific types of undertakings did you convey to ensure that everyone who was supposed to get out of Afghanistan was taken out of Afghanistan?
My job was to overall manage the evacuation, so making sure that we have the proper authorities, enough not only the resources, but the authorities needed for them to be able to do their job. And then the Chief of Defense Staff goes in.
Okay. Okay, the point was, you just read out what this discussion was supposed to be about today, and he replied in the generality as opposed to the specifics that he wanted to address. So it's just...
I'm trying to be kind.
If I were him, I wouldn't have answered your question, but that's another issue. But that's just me.
Must have been so much chaos on the ground. What would have been the process for someone who wanted to get out of Afghanistan?
I would say that a lot of work was done beforehand, and I want to actually thank the members of Parliament who were involved with that, whether it was supporting the interpreters or vulnerable populations, forwarding that information to the IRCC at that time. I knew that even us, when I was Minister of Defense, the Canadian Armed Forces provided a list of people that actually who worked for us. We provided that to the IRCC. Other NGOs like the Buller Foundations were also providing information, but everything worked off an approved list. So even through that chaos, we had to be very mindful that just imagine with the tens of thousands of people who were there, I mean, we all saw the images and how heartbreaking it is. And it was heartbreaking for anybody who actually served there. But through all that hardship, I would just want to also mention, just to the Canadian Armed Forces who were on the ground, because at that time they were accused of not helping as much. They saved so many people's lives. I've got to meet some of the interpreters and their families who are actually here. And it's because of that effort. And they did it in extreme circumstances. And sadly, I also want to say, let's not forget, 11 U.S. soldiers lost their lives at a point at the location where we in the UK were manning. That was our location. We followed the intelligence very closely. We made the decision to stop at that time. But sadly, U.S. personnel were killed at that time. We did that safely as possible, but even through all those people, I know all of us feel a level of guilt because people that we worked with were left behind. But I know those efforts did not stop. I know of people that...
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there. We're way past.
I want to ask you about the prioritization of the groups. And after this Government of Canada press release on August 13th, was there any kind of change in the prioritization of the various groups that were in Afghanistan and the vulnerable groups outside of the priority groups?
Which time are you referring to?
This press release on August 13th, where prior to that we had a prioritization on Canadian citizens, permanent residents, Afghan interpreters, and fixers. And subsequent to that were vulnerable Afghans. Was there a change?
No, that's a great question. Actually, that was referring to on the August 13th press release, right? So that was what the immigration minister, and as I mentioned, the letter that hopefully you'll see afterwards that was signed by 25 members of Parliament, which included Conservative members of Parliament. And I have to admit, the work of the foundation that you're talking about was actually with the Conservative Party, where it actually started first, right? And so this, yes, it was added on August 13th for the vulnerable groups.
Okay. But did it change the prioritization away from Canadians per se and permanent residents, interpreters and fixers to prioritize other groups?
So it was as it clearly states in the press release, they were added to the special immigration status.
Right. Okay. As vulnerable classes.
Yes.
Okay. And was JTF2 sent outside the wire to collect any of these other groups, or even for the Canadians and the PRs that might have been in Afghanistan?
Look, one is I'm not going to discuss JTF2 operations, but I can tell you that they had all the authorities necessary to carry out their work. What they deemed necessary was on the ground, and they also knew the vulnerabilities. And the reason I'm kind of emphasizing here is interpreters did also make it out, and their families. And I had the pleasure of meeting some of them.
Is your time up? Okay. Thank you. Minister, did Canadian Armed Forces at all at any point in time express any concern about the change in direction after August 13th?
There wasn't. First of all, it was added to. It's not a change in direction. This was a government policy that was created at the behest of members of Parliament, and to be honest, and mostly from your party, right? That were added on. So they were added on. The Canadian Armed Forces,
No,
as
at
you
the
know,
same time, I don't think that letter
as you know, they
said that
do
we
their
would
work.
not
They
prioritize
do their
Canadians
work. They have
over
a
other
list, and they executed that policy. One thing I can assure you, when it comes to the people who they work with, they did their absolute 110% to making sure that they supported everyone for the evacuation.
So how well were you briefed, and what further direction did you provide after the evacuation started and after the news release came on August 13th? So from August 13th to August 27th, when the evacuations ended, how involved were you in that at that point in time?
When it comes to the list and the immigration measures, that's done through IRCC. But I'm talking. Of course, I'm trying to get to that. Our job was to actually conduct the evacuation safely, and that's what we were actually focused on. So a lot of the questions were in terms of prioritization and things. That's for IRCC to discuss. What we were doing was creating the environment for a safe evacuation.
Zan.